Today, I want to introduce the thought of John Locke from his essay, The Second Treatise of Government, which I'll be reading from this book by Hackett, Political Writings of Locke. To my mind, Locke is second only to Descartes as being the most important figure of early modern philosophy. And that's because his ideas were so influential at the time, but also, even more importantly, because his ideas are so powerful that they have continued to be the core ideas that our contemporary world lives off of. So I'm going to introduce Locke just through two sections, through chapter 2 of the second treatise, where we'll introduce the basic idea of what government is, and chapter 5, which will introduce the theme of property, and especially the very interesting theme of what money is. So Locke begins by asking us just to imagine what the natural condition of human beings is. And our basic nature is that we are free. We have the capacities to dispose of our own actions as we see fit. And with respect to that, we're all equal. Right? So he says, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit. It's a state also of equality. So, we're all naturally equal and equally free. So in our natural state, other people might or might not treat us nicely, right? Because they're free, that's up to them, right? And so with respect to that, Locke says, well, yes, this is a state of freedom, but that doesn't mean it's okay to do anything you like. So he says at the beginning of section 6, but though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license, right? You're sort of logically and metaphysically free, so you're able to do whatever you want, but that doesn't mean it's okay to do whatever you want. And the specific thing he says is that man has not liberty to destroy himself or so much of any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. Right? So he's saying you're not free to do just anything. You can't go around destroying things. The only situation in which you can do that is when there is something nobler. Right? So his point is that it's also a matter of our natural condition that we find ourselves accountable to certain higher values. And that's what he says in the next sentence. He says, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Right? So in our natural condition, we're free, but we're also rational. And, Locke doesn't really cash out in great technical depth what he means by reason. But the point, I think, is clear enough. Our nature as rational beings means that we find ourselves inherently spoken to by moral values, right? We find ourselves compelled by oughts. As he says, anyone who will but consult his reason will see this, will experience that there is a matter of ought, that there is a matter of should. But in any case, then Locke is saying that's kind of our natural condition. We're free. We're in competition with other free beings who, because they're free, might not be very nice to us. It's up to them. But it's not okay not to be nice to each other. And so we are also then in the situation of having to deal with the fact, both with respect to ourselves and with respect to others, that good and bad things could be happening, or things could be happening that shouldn't be happening, and we've got to deal with that, right? Other people could wrong us. We might also wrong other people. So if we wrong other people, it's up to us to stop that and correct it. If other people wrong us, we have the proper authority. We have the right to try to stop them. Indeed, in a basic way, that's our duty, right? So as he says, The execution of the law of nature is in that state, in our natural condition, put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. Right? So, in our natural condition, it's up to us to basically defend the good, defend what ought to be done in, fighting back against people who mistreat us, but also, of course, making sure we don't mistreat other people. Now, that's our natural condition, and his point is that natural condition really isn't very satisfactory. Why? Primarily because it means it's up to each individual to, judge himself and hold himself accountable to that law. And you can't really count on people to do that, right? So, if somebody mistreats you, you should be able to say to him, yeah, you did the wrong thing. You should take that back and fix things. But you can't really count on people to do that because, as he says, it is unreasonable for men to be judges in their own cases. For he says, it's easily to be imagined that he who was so unjust as to do his brother an injury will scarce be so just as to condemn himself for it. Right? If someone's going to choose to go around and be bad, by that fact alone, they kind of show themselves to be people who you can't really count on to then turn to the moral law to correct those things. Right? So, in our natural condition, in our conflicts, as you might find if you're just by yourself as a elementary school student dealing with, the bully on the school playground or whatever, the fact that you sort of naturally have the authority to call someone out for being bad doesn't really produce a happy situation. In that natural state, even though we all have the natural capacity to be moral, it's not really going to happen. It's not going to happen that people are just spontaneously all going to go around acting nicely and sort out all their problems. Right? And you can find evidence for that around you all the time. So, he says, there is a remedy for that. Right? He says, I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature. Right? That's what government is for. Government is for taking us out of that situation of unmanageable conflict and ensuring that the basic sort of moral rules that protect individuals in their legitimate pursuit of their own free activities, right, to make sure that that is protected and preserved. And so this then is the big point, it seems to me, of the second treatise. It's to identify government as a thing that comes up in human communities for the sake of those human communities as the way of solving this problem. As individuals, we have, proper moral relationships to each other. We have relations of justice to each other, but we can't count on those things being sorted out properly if individuals are left to sort them out on their own. So what we need to do is we need to appoint some third beyond the individuals who are in competition. We have to appoint some third who has the authority to carry out those rules of justice. Why? Because individuals cannot be entrusted with the authority to be judges in their own cases. So government is a sort of third being to which we give our own sort of natural authority for making moral judgments of justice and right in these relationships between people. We say we give up having the authority to make that decision ourselves and put that power in a third party who's going to make those judgments for us. We all have to, collectively agree to that. We all have to collectively consent to that. But when we do that, we have a power we can depend on to carry out justice and the right. Right? And so he says, this is now, just I'll read a little bit from chapter 4. He says, the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth. Right? I mean, that's kind of how we start. But that produces a particular problem that we've seen, right? But the liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the Commonwealth. And then what is the character of that freedom? The freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. So, government is an impersonal body that establishes the rule by which we are to live and enforces that rule. Right? So, when you're governed, properly speaking, you are governed by law, not by a ruler, not by a king, right? If you have some individual who's in charge of things, well, then you're still subject to a person who cannot be expected to be a competent judge in his or her own case. So that's the core idea from basically the first 4 chapters of the second treatise of government, that human beings need to have their freedom protected. Human beings are individuals who have the right to dispose of their lives as they want, provided they do it within the terms of respecting the rights of others. And that situation can only really be established when, by consent, people accept to be governed by laws that institute those very principles and rules, and that are administered by people, the government. And it is by establishing that third party, that third impersonal party that is the rule of law, that we are actually enabled to essentially fulfill our nature and live as free individuals. Now, in talking about our natural condition, Locke was talking about our rights and our freedom. And then in chapter 5, he goes on to show that you can't talk about our natural condition without talking about property, and indeed the right to property. Why is that? Well, it's because even though, reality is kind of commonly there for everybody, you have to appropriate some of it to yourself. That is to say, exclude other people from it and say this is mine alone, or you can't even exist. Right? So it is, again, our natural condition that we have a right to live, and therefore we have a right to take the fruits of the earth and enjoy them so as to perpetuate our own lives. Right? That means you can't realistically conceive of a person without conceiving of them as having a right to property. Right? So what is property? Well, he says the specific thing that really makes something your property, you can discern by looking at that situation. What happened? You went out and you did some work to get that thing. And so it was the investment of your labor in the thing that made it yours, right? Because that labor, that was your contribution. It was just you putting yourself into it. And that is yours. Nobody else can have that, right? So he says in section 27, whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. And so Locke really wants to emphasize that, and that's his real insight here, right? That's how you make something your property. You invest something into it. So let's picture ourselves in our natural condition. You're just out in the wilderness. You got to eat. You come upon a tree with some apples growing on it. You put some work into picking those apples so that you can eat them. That makes them yours. Somebody else, of course, is entitled to do that too. They can also come to that tree and pick some apples and eat them, and they would be theirs. But it's not okay for someone to come and take the apples you picked and say, oh, I want those, and eat them. You're going to say, no, pick your own apples. Those are mine. Right? Or similarly, imagine, again, still you're out in the wilderness. You get some branches and some leaves and so on, and you make yourself a shelter because you need somewhere to live, right? Yeah, that's your house. You made it yours by investing yourself into it and making a thing that is an embodiment of your labor. And it's not okay for someone to come along and say, oh, that's a nice house. I want it. You can say, no, that's mine. Make your own, which they're entitled to do, but they can't take yours. Or again, similarly, you might cultivate a little plot of land, make a garden or whatever, to make a little situation in which you can grow things. Well, that's your garden. You've made that thing your own now. And it's not okay for someone to come and try to take it. But also, you can't just look out over a huge tract of land or over the ocean and say, oh, that's mine because I want it. Right? You haven't done anything to it to make it yours. Right? So then he goes on to talk about that notion of the investment of labor into the thing. And the point he wants to make throughout that section is that, interestingly, when we put labor into nature, we actually, typically, improve what the world can offer, right? As we cultivate land, we invest labor into the soil and so on, we can make a tract of land produce much more food, much more grain than it would ever just produce naturally. So by our putting labor into it, we actually make the world a place that can provide more goods for people than it can on its own. Right? So by working on the soil in some area, I've made it my garden, I've made it my thing, but I haven't really taken value away from the common world. Rather, by appropriating that and investing my labor in it, I've made it a thing that actually adds value to the common world. And so he says, he who appropriates land to himself by his labor does not lessen, but increase the common stock of mankind. For the provisions serving to the support of human life produced by 1 acre of enclosed and cultivated land are 10 times more than those which are yielded by an acre of land of an equal richness, lying waste in common. And therefore, he that encloses land and has a greater plenty of the convenience of life from 10 acres than he could have from 100 left to nature may truly be said to give 90 acres to mankind. Right? There's more about that. But anyway, that's a particularly powerful notion. And he goes on throughout this to draw our attention to all kinds of ways in which there are things that we value, like bread, but what we actually value in them is mostly labor. Right? The bread, yeah, it has its roots in some wheat plant at some level, but the wheat contributes comparatively little to that product bread at the end. The thing that makes it bread is mostly all the work that people did to grow it, to harvest it, to mill it, to cook it, to ship it, and do all the rest of the process that brings you bread. And so he really wants to turn your attention to the notion that value largely comes from labor. The third point then Locke says, is how much property can you have? Because he says you might think if someone says, you have a right to take stuff, that you could just take as much as you want. But he says in section 31, it will perhaps be objected to this that if gathering the acorns or other fruits of the earth and so on makes a right to them, then anyone may engross as much as he will. But he says, no, that's not true. He says, for the same kind of laws of nature that are available to anybody who reasons, right? You can see that, back in the first section, you can see that you got to treat people with justice. You can see here that you need to be able to have property. He says, well, you can also see that there is a natural limit to property, right? What it makes sense to say you're entitled to is what you can actually use. And so if you just take stuff and hoard it and it goes to waste, that wasn't your property. That was you stealing other people's property, not letting them have what they need just because you could use your power to get it. but you didn't use it. It wasn't properly yours, right? So there was no justice in your taking that. That right there is the core structure now of his analysis of property, what it is, and what that you have a right to it. But then the last point I want to make is just the thing he adds at the end, which is about the nature of money. So he says, we as human beings have invented this thing, money. And that has actually significantly changed the world of dealing with property from that kind of natural condition. How? With the invention of money, it's possible for people sort of not to violate the rules of wastage, not obviously to be taking things away from other people and pointlessly destroying them, and still hoard great wealth. If you grow a bunch of apples, you don't just have to keep those apples, you can sell them. You get something else that stores that same amount of exchangeable value, but the thing you get might not deteriorate quite as fast as the apples. So his point there is, with the invention of money, we have produced a way that people can sort of bypass the kind of natural obstacle to hoarding that comes from the deterioration and wasting of products by producing a material medium that preserves and stores value without itself being something that will deteriorate. So he says in section 46, the greatest part of things that are really useful to the life of man are generally things of short duration. Now, of those things which nature hath provided in common, everyone has a right, as hath been said, to as much as he could use, and has a property in that he could effect with his labor, right? And he says now in section 48, though, as different degrees of industry were apt to give men possession in different proportions, so the invention of money gave them the opportunity to continue and enlarge them. He says in section 50, it is plain that men have agreed to disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth, having, by a tacit and voluntary consent, found out a way that a man may fairly possess more land than he himself can use of the product, by receiving in exchange for the overplus gold and silver, which may be hoarded up without injury to anyone, these metals not spoiling or decaying in the hands of the possessor. So the introduction of money has made it possible for people to accumulate great wealth without sort of violating the natural laws of property, and in so doing has introduced a situation of great inequality. So that, it seems to me, is Locke's basic analysis of the political and economic condition of human beings, and that's the foundation of our contemporary societies, really. How those issues have been played out in political life and the further complex political issues they raise, that's a further question.